evening. My name is Sarah Watson, and I'm with Looking for Lincoln. Heather, can you join me on screen for just a minute?
Hi.
I know I didn't tell you I was going to do this. So many, by the way, I've been watching where people are from. People are from all over the country tonight. Welcome, welcome. But I'm going to embarrass Heather just a little bit because so many of you know Heather and know her well, but she had this secret thing she did last month that many of you will want to celebrate with her and don't know. Heather Wickens is now Mrs. Heather Feeser. So I thought it'd be nice to do a little bit of congratulations, Heather.
Thank you.
Yes, now you can go back off. Welcome to tonight's show, The Lost Speech Found, Abraham Lincoln and the Founding of the Republican Party. This is a part of a series of Looking for Lincoln conversations that I know many of you join us monthly. For more information about the Looking for Lincoln conversations, visit the Looking for Lincoln Facebook page. Tonight, The Lost Speech Found, Abraham Lincoln and the Founding of the Illinois Republican Party. On May 29, 1856, Lincoln gave the keynote address at a convention held in downtown Bloomington to establish a new political party opposed to the expansion of slavery, the Republican Party. Learn why this speech became to be known as the Lost Speech and how it's not really lost. With us tonight, we have Bill Kemp. He has served as librarian for the not-for-profit McLean County Museum of History in Bloomington for 19 years. So I think you're going to hear from an expert this evening. Bill, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. And will I see the program? Yes, good. Okay, we're ready to go. Time is of the essence. I thought I had 40 minutes, but it's really closer to 30 minutes. So we'll see how this all goes. But I'm so happy to be here. This is really quite an honor. Before I begin talks, I always like to throw a few caveats out there, set the bar low, if you will, right? In this instance, I will remind everyone that I am not a Lincoln scholar. Rather, I'm a local history librarian and public historian who tells the stories of McLean County and Bloomington Normal, its community and its history to the general public. So I'm coming at Lincoln from that angle. And no, I don't blindly idolize Lincoln, far from it. I don't think it's healthy to blindly idolize anybody, not that anybody listening in does, though there is much to admire in the man, for sure, as we'll see this evening. Okay, so what I'm going to do here in the short time we have is to provide an overview of the establishment of the State Republican Party, which dates to the state convention of the anti-Nebraska Party of Illinois, as mentioned in the introduction, held in Bloomington on May 29, 1856. It was that evening that Abraham Lincoln delivered the keynote address, which later became known as the Lost Speech, so-called. Why, you might be wondering, was the May 29, 1856 gathering in Bloomington called something so lumbering as the state convention of the anti-Nebraska Party of Illinois? What did this political movement and supporting delegates have against the territory, future territory and state of Nebraska? Of course, it was not Nebraska they opposed, as seen here, but rather the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and its threat to expand slavery into heretofore free northern territories. But here I am getting ahead of myself a little bit. So this brief talk will provide the who, what, and where, if you will, of this convention and Lincoln's speech. And as I do, I think we'll come to know some of the substance and much of the tenor of said speech. All the while, we must keep in mind the interconnected issues of race and slavery and how the Bloomington Normal community and the Republican Party have seen fit over the years to remember and often misremember the lost speech. Writer and historian Ida Tarbell, who gained fame as a muckraking progressive era journalist, also wrote extensively on Lincoln and Tarbell was fascinated with the lost speech. What was Lincoln doing in Bloomington? Well, he was leading an effort to form a new political party, gathering Illinoisans who, despite their varying political allegiances, coalesced around one issue: opposition to the extension of slavery. The lost speech would then conclude a political convention that lasted one day that marked the formation of what would soon become known as the Illinois Republican Party and the ascension of Lincoln as its moral voice and de facto leader. Well, you might be wondering, why was it called the lost speech? And we're going to get to that just in a bit later. Anyway, back to Ida Tarbell, right? In her 1939 autobiography, All in a Day's Work, she wrote about the real fun of Lincoln research. And this is Ida Tarbell writing here. Quote, "Whenever I found an Illinois man whom had been with Lincoln on the circuit or in public life, I would bombard him with questions. Tarbell was especially interested in Lincoln's voice and speaking style. Those I interviewed all talked more about the Lincoln-Douglas debates than any other topic, but frequently they would conclude by saying, well, those were good speeches, but they were nothing like the lost speech. That was the greatest thing Lincoln ever did." Or a man would begin by saying, and this is Ida Tarbell again, "Well, you can never know much about him as a speaker. Nobody can that never heard the lost speech." Although Lincoln would be the first Republican Party candidate to win the presidency, he was a member of the Whig Party for most of his life, until the Whigs collapsed, that is, in 1856 under the weight of the slavery issue. A national political party, right, torn asunder just as the nation would be a few years later. Let's just look at Lincoln's views on the institution of slavery, human bondage. One, Lincoln believed his entire political career enslavement of other human beings was a moral wrong, right, that had to be remedied in some manner. Two, slavery's extension should be halted. And three, once halted, slavery in the United States should be phased out. Obviously, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was explicit in noting time and again that slavery was protected constitutionally where it existed. Yet his goal was to hem it in so it would wither and die right on the vine. And let's be clear, opposition to slavery also is not to be confused with a belief in racial equality. We opened our Abraham Lincoln and McLean County exhibit in spring of 2016. It's been 6 years, right? Why another Lincoln exhibit? Why another Lincoln book? Why another Lincoln statue, for goodness sakes, right? Those are all good questions. But to answer the why a Lincoln exhibit question, well, as we like to point out at the McLean County Museum of History, it's believed Lincoln spent more time in Bloomington than anywhere else during his adult life, from the time he becomes an attorney in the latter half of the 1830s until he leaves for Washington, D.C. in early 1861 to move into the White House. He's in Bloomington a tremendous amount. Bloomington is on the 8th Judicial Circuit. Lincoln owns property in Bloomington, close friends and associates, important political speeches are given here, on and on, right? But more importantly, in our exhibit, we attempt to trace Lincoln's return to the political stage in 1854 with passage of the reviled Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Lincoln's then titanic struggle against the act's architect, right, Stephen A. Douglas. And wrapped up in all of this are the interwoven issues of slavery and its extension, race and racism, and the future role of Black people in American society. And Bloomington becomes an important stage for this great moral contest for the nation's soul in the decade before the Civil War. Lincoln is giving anti-Nebraska speeches here in 1854, 1856, 1858, 1860. The museum, my employer, where I'm speaking from right now, occupies the fourth courthouse in McLean County's history on the old courthouse square. The building I'm in right now was finished and dedicated in 1903, but we're looking at here at the Lincoln era courthouse, which was built in 1836, one of several federal style or four square courthouses in Illinois at the time. Lincoln was in Bloomington so much because as the 8th Judicial Circuit evolved and changed, counties were dropped and picked up. One of the constants during his entire law career was that Bloomington was on the 8th Judicial Circuit. I was losing interest in politics when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, that is, passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, aroused me again, that is, back to the political stage. This was Abraham Lincoln writing in his 599-word autobiography, which he did so in 1859. So by overturning the Missouri Compromise, in which the compromise line prohibited slavery in what would become the states of Kansas and Nebraska, as well as potentially parts of the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming, the Kansas-Nebraska Act set off an absolute political firestorm that will end with the American Civil War. So instead of prohibiting slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act relied on the mechanism of popular sovereignty, right? Whereby each new territory and its settlers would decide whether or not to admit the practice of slavery. After all, what could be more American than letting the voters decide, right? On the contrary, Abraham Lincoln argued, one does not vote for or against the institution of slavery. One cannot perpetuate a wrong in the name of self-government. Popular sovereignty, Lincoln said, was not a mechanism of self-government. Rather, it was a mechanism of despotism. So it's important to note, of course, if we pause for a moment, that Lincoln in 1856 was not advocating for political or social equality for African Americans, even free blacks in Illinois. And in the mid-1850s, as I've already alluded to, the future great emancipator was a moderate anti-slavery Whig looking for another political home, who readily acknowledged the constitutional protections then afforded slave owners where the odious institution already existed. That said, right, we need to also emphasize that unlike U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, again, the architect, right, of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln well understood, right, the incompatibility of slavery and the promise of America, despite how often that promise comes up short. Lincoln's self-described ancient faith was rooted in the Declaration of Independence and its principle that all men are created equal. Popular sovereignty, of course, proved no match for the passions of the slavery debate, and it was only a matter of time before a proxy war erupted between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the Kansas Territory. Here's the remarkable mural, celebrated mural by John Stuart Curry, located on the second floor rotunda of the Kansas State Capitol building. Popular sovereignty, in fact, right, led to bleeding or bloody Kansas. Here we see Old Testament prophet and avenger and high moralist and cold-blooded killer, John Brown, front and center there. Prelude to what? Well, of course, the answer is obvious, the American Civil War. Note the black man fighting for his freedom on the left and the enslaved people being trampled by Confederate soldiers and border ruffians, that is, pro-slavery raiders. Note too the twister. The storm is coming for sure, right? One that would lead to the deaths of more than 600,000 Americans. In late 1855, Free Soilers established their own state constitution and government, creating the spectacle of competing territorial legislatures and capitals, pro-slave and anti-slave, right? With citizens beholden to one or the other. A real quick point, another pause, if you will, right? We need to discard what we know of the Republican and Democratic parties today. They are far different political animals, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in the 19th century that they are today, right? On February 22nd, 1856, the anti-Nebraska newspaper editors in Illinois gathered in Decatur to lay the groundwork for a new anti-slavery extension party. There was support from about 20 or so anti-Nebraska papers in the state of Illinois. This was a time when newspapers were closely associated with a political party. Yet a snowstorm at the time of this gathering, right, meant that only about a half a dozen of the newspaper men, and they were all men, right, we're in the patriarchy at this time, were able to make it to Decatur. Lincoln, Forrest Gump-like, was there as a guest and observer. He seemed to be everywhere, right? The Decatur platform was moderate, all things considered, careful not to antagonize conservative Whigs, or even know-nothings, yet also unequivocal in its opposition to slavery's expansion. I've already mentioned that Lincoln was an anti-slavery Whig, but who the heck were the know-nothings? Well, know-nothings, who often campaigned under the American Party banner, were a potent political force in the 1850s. They were a nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, often pro-temperance political movement that nonetheless opposed the expansion of slavery on the grounds that it threatened white free labor. The dilemma for Lincoln and other anti-Nebraska leaders who wanted to create a vibrant, competitive political party was wooing a sufficient number of northern know-nothings to their side while being careful not to alienate potential allies such as German immigrants, another large block of anti-Nebraska votes. It was a tightrope for sure. Lincoln, for instance, found the know-nothings anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic platforms contemptible, but he was careful not to denounce them publicly. Why, right? He needed them for an even greater struggle, halting the extension of slavery. Anyway, this Decatur meeting set the stage for the Bloomington Convention of May 29, 1856, that would occur 3 months later. So the 250 or so delegates that streamed into Bloomington for that convention included fugitives from the collapsing Whig Party, anti-slavery Northerners like Lincoln, Democrats who also opposed the expansion of slavery, liberty-loving German immigrants, many refugees from the failed German revolutions of 1848-49, abolitionists, obviously, and even, yes, anti-immigrant know-nothings. The one issue that drew them together, that fused them, kept them together, right, was opposing the extension of slavery into free northern territories. Officially, Lincoln served as the convention chairman, or chairman of the nominating committee, which wasn't a big deal, yet in actuality, he was central to the proceedings. In preparation for the Bloomington Convention, counties in Illinois had mass meetings to select delegates to the convention, but many counties in southern Illinois, where the anti-black Democratic Party dominated, sent no delegates. The May 29, 1856 state convention that led to the establishment of the Illinois Republican Party, and these conventions were happening kind of organically throughout the North, so several other states can lay claim to being the birthplace of the national Republican Party, but Bloomington can lay claim to being the birthplace of the Illinois GOP, right? So the convention itself was held in the long-gone three-story building known as Majors Hall, which was located at Front and East Streets in downtown Bloomington. The first floor was for retail trade, the second for offices or light industry, and the third held a 3,000 square foot hall or open public space featuring tall windows for light and good air circulation. Right before the convention, Lincoln was in Danville, where the judicial circuit was in session. He was, of course, a working attorney at the time, right? He had to pay the bills. Lincoln then traveled by train from Danville aboard the Great Western to Decatur, and from there north to Bloomington on the Illinois Central, and he was accompanied by fellow 8th Circuit attorney Henry C. Whitney. The evening before his speech, Lincoln spoke from the Pike House, a popular hotel at the corner of Center and Monroe Streets in downtown Bloomington. We see an image here. He told those gathered that he had prepared a speech for the convention, yet he did not read from a prepared text the following day at Majors Hall, and so it appears that the speech was never written out, at least by him. During the convention, Lincoln did not stay at the Pike House, but rather at the home of Judge David Davis, even though Davis himself was still in Danville presiding over court. Oh, let's go back here. Apologize for that. The delegates adopted a series of resolutions that shaped the contours of the new political party. Lyman Trumbull of Alton and Lincoln handled the final revisions. There was Lincoln again, helping to shape the final platform of this new political party. The platform, right, recognized Congress's constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, declared that the principles of freedom expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, quote, require that power should be exerted to prevent the extension of slavery into territories heretofore free, and pledged to oppose disunionists who made covert or overt threats to secede from the federal government. The platform also shed any remaining vestiges of know-nothingism by declaring the new party would proscribe, that is, ban no one by legislation or otherwise on account of their religious opinions or in consequence of their place of birth. What we must keep in mind, right, is the political context and the current events, right, occurring at the same time of the Bloomington Convention in the latter half of May 1856. This was an exceptionally tumultuous, scary time in U.S. history. On May 22nd, 7 days before the Bloomington Convention, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was beaten senseless on the august floor of the U.S. Senate chamber by South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks. Brooks was so enraged that Sumner had the audacity to speak out against slavery and slaveholders, including a relative of Brooks, Andrew Butler, a South Carolina senator, that it was deemed that he deserved such treatment, right? Sumner's address, which was given over 2 days, was known as the Crime Against Kansas. The caning of Sumner occurred while a series of violent clashes in the Kansas territory just roiled the nation. 1 day earlier, on May 21st, Lawrence, Kansas, an anti-slavery stronghold, was sacked by a pro-slavery mob. And as a reaction to such depredations, on the night of May 24-25, a group led by John Brown hacked to death 5 pro-slavery settlers in front of their families, no less. This was north of Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County. Brown, of course, would go on to lead the ill-fated raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia in October 1859, one of the flashpoints on the road to the Civil War. James S. Emery, who was publisher of the Kansas Free State newspaper in Lawrence, spoke to the convention, one of the refugees, right, of chaotic, bleeding Kansas, finding himself in Bloomington. Pro-slavery forces had destroyed his newspaper and press in Lawrence and then drove him from the territory, so he, quote, dare not return for fear of being butchered. Emery went on to suggest to the delegates at the convention that 500 mounted anti-slavery men, well-armed and provisioned, would help turn things around in the Kansas territory, right? Might meets might. Lincoln, in his lost speech, according to one count, has him responding to Emery's call for armed resistance in Kansas with this, quote, no, my friends, I tell you what we will do. We will wait until November and the election, and then we will shoot paper ballots at them. So, hey, I just gave you a little bit of the lost speech right there, right? Also during the convention, as we see here, the first territorial governor of Kansas, Andrew H. Reeder, was in Bloomington. He had been removed as governor by Democratic President Franklin Pierce and indicted for treason. He escaped arrest, was then secreted through Kansas and Missouri by anti-slavery compatriots, and disguising himself at one point as a wood chopper, right? Hence this image. Reeder reached the safety of Free State, Illinois, a day or two before the Bloomington Convention, and not surprisingly, he became something of a folk hero in the North. After the anti-Nebraska convention gavelled to a close with Lincoln's lost speech on the evening of May 29th, Reeder delivered a 3-hour speech before a crowd variously estimated between 5,000 and 8,000 on the courthouse square in downtown Bloomington. In fact, right where I am at this very moment. I know where was my trigger warning for this angry Lincoln, right? A Bloomington businessman specializing in public relations, Arthur Elwell Chrissy, authored several books in his lifetime, including this one, Lincoln's Lost Speech, the pivot of his career, which came out in 1967. Yes, that has to be one of the wildest Lincoln illustrations I've ever seen, or to make it to print. But the artist is Lloyd Ostendorf, whose signature work is Lincoln, and I'm sure many listening are well familiar with his work. He also was a recognized authority on Lincoln photographs, holding one during his lifetime, holding one of the larger private collections ever assembled. And his reference work, Lincoln in Photographs, remains a classic in Lincoln studies. Elwell Chrissy passed away in 1992 at the age of 92. I checked A Books the other night, and you can buy a copy in good condition for about $5. And by gosh, I will say it holds up reasonably well. I'll just say that, right? Though I am not the biggest fan of these illustrations. I'm just saying. But hey, I'm no critic, or critic certainly, and I have no eye for such things anyhow. After completing the convention's formal business, delegates returned to Majors Hall for an evening of speech making. Lincoln's address, delivered before an estimated 1,100 people that included delegates, supporters, and curious onlookers, started around 5:30 p.m. and lasted about 90 minutes. Okay, before we get to the lost part of the speech, let me point out that the cavernous auditorium depicted here does not bear much of a relation to the cramped hall that hosted the one-day convention, right? You could probably fit 3 Majors halls in this one scene, right? Anyway, according to legend, the fervid brilliancy of Lincoln's speech caused enraptured supporters and newspapermen to throw away their pens and live, as William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, put it, in the inspiration of the hour. Well, perhaps, right? But I'm not sure that quite passes the smell test. Another explanation as to why the speech was lost is self-censorship. Lincoln might have been adverse to seeing his fiery words transcribed in shorthand and then make their way into print. After all, as we'll see in a moment, his apparent anti-slavery passion this evening and his not-so-subtle warning to the South ran contrary to efforts to place a moderate veneer on this emerging anti-Nebraska party, right? They wanted to be a party of former Democrats, of conservative moderate Whigs. Don't look at the abolitionists in our ranks, concentrate on the more moderate parts. But here was Lincoln preaching to the converted, right, delegates, so perhaps he himself got a little bit carried away. The label lost speech, of course, is also somewhat of a misnomer, noted Lincoln's future White House Secretary John G. Nicolay in May 19th, 1900, in a letter to Ezra M. Prince of the McLean County Historical Society. Nicolay noted, right, that, quote, 50 speeches which Lincoln made in the 1856 presidential campaign were never put in print, yet they're not known as the lost speech, right? Okay, I promised to find the lost speech, fair enough. So the best way to do that is read contemporary newspaper coverage. For even if there was self-censorship, and there appears to be a fair amount, right, there was also some descriptive reportage that shines a remarkable light on Lincoln and what he said that evening, right? Unfortunately, the local newspaper, the weekly Panagraph, the weekly Bloomington Panagraph, is not much help, right? Of the lost speech, the paper has this to say, quote, Mr. Lincoln's points were unanswerable and the force and power of his appeals irresistible, and were received by a storm of applause. And to that, I just say yawn, right? That's all we get from the local newspaper. The fact that anti-slavery principles define the greater part of this new political party really infuriated the Democratic Party press, right? The Democratic Party newspapers wrote that the new Republican Party's opposition to slavery's expansion would lead to the total abolition of slavery and, horror of horrors, things like interracial marriage, right? And I'll read a part or all of this. They go for the entire colored platform, declared the Springfield State Register, the city's Democratic Party paper. They, meaning this new Republican Party, put the whole black creed into the ring. Nobody will call in question the sable orthodoxy of these thugs, amalgamationists, and amalgamated thugs. Sable orthodoxy here means black orthodoxy, right? And amalgamationist means somebody who supports miscegenation, right? Miscegenation being a fancy word for sexual relations between people of different races. So you see the Democratic Party's motivation here is to instill fear among white Northern voters, and that's a theme into the Civil War. The most complete account of Lincoln's speech comes from the June 5th, 1856 Weekly Courier of Alton. Lincoln was here ready to fuse with anyone who would unite with him to oppose slave power, the Courier reported. Lincoln also declared, quote, that the Union must be preserved in the purity of its principles as well as the integrity of its territorial parts. And quoting Daniel Webster's response to Robert Hayne in 1830, Lincoln had this to say, quote, it must be liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Union, in other words, Lincoln was telling the people gathered here, was not enough. And it was certainly not enough as the nation retreated from the promise of the Declaration of Independence to embrace the spread of slavery through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. For Lincoln, union meant both the integrity of its territorial parts, but also the purity of its principles. You could not have one without the other. During the speech, according to account in the Belleville Weekly Advocate, Lincoln criticized national Whigs, a term for members of his former party who, in the name of national unity, refused to fuse with the sectional anti-Nebraska movement. Lincoln said these conservative Whigs, who were fearful of alienating and antagonizing the South, embraced union, but at a cost of aiding and abetting the expansion of slavery ever westward. National Whigs, quote, are all the time stepping about to the music of the Union, said a sarcastic Lincoln. He had no doubt but that the music of an overseer's lash upon a mulatto girl's back would make some of them dance a Virginia hornpipe. Let them step, said Lincoln. Let them dance to the music of the Union, or what they thought was the music to the Union, but that's actually an overseer's lash on a girl's back, while we, my old friends, stand fast by principle and freedom and the Union together, right? So here is the lost speech, right? We found at least a part of it. We've gained a significant glimpse of the power of Lincoln's oratory and really the radicalism, right, that he was kind of leading this new political movement through. Again, Lincoln was saying here that union in and of itself was not enough. Union, in his estimation, had to be tied to the ideals of freedom and liberty, or union wasn't worth the effort. Here's Lincoln's former law partner recalling Lincoln's lost speech. His speech was right set ablaze by the divine fires of a soul maddened by the wrong. It was hard, heavy, knotty, gnarly, backed with wrath, right? You don't get any words or excerpts from Lincoln, but you sure get the emotion, again, of that evening. Newspaper accounts are vital to telling this story, but certainly, as Lincoln biographer Michael Burlingame would tell us, so are personal recollections and reminiscences. At the Bloomington Convention, anti-Nebraska delegates nominated William H. Bissell of Belleville for governor and German-born Francis A. Hoffman of DuPage County for lieutenant governor. Ward Hill Layman is misspelled here. Bissell was a Mexican war hero, a Catholic, and an anti-slavery Democrat. Was in the poorest of health. He had contracted syphilis during the Mexican War, apparently. Yet after some hemming and hawing, he agreed to run. Candidates running on the anti-Nebraska ticket, as we see here, formally adopted the Republican Party label several months later, and the new party swept statewide offices, right? Bissell, in fact, will die in the governor's mansion or in Springfield, I believe, in 1860 during his first and only term. Though the Republicans sweep the statewide offices, Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont loses Illinois in the national election to Democrat James Buchanan. The 1856 campaign, interestingly, lives on in street names on Bloomington's south side next to what is today Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. Fremont, the Republican presidential candidate, captured the New England states, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Democrat James Buchanan carried Illinois with 44% of the vote. Fremont trailed close behind by 40%, while the American Party's Millard Fillmore, that's right, the former president running as a third-party candidate, as the nativist know-nothing, garnered nearly 60%, but just as Lincoln feared, the know-nothings were still powerful enough to spoil Fremont's chances in Illinois. By drawing away votes from Republicans, know-nothings also helped Buchanan capture New Jersey and possibly several other northern states. Despite an 1872 fire and the loss of the third floor where the convention was held, here you see a Majors Hall in circa 1955, shorn of its third floor. It remained occupied over the many years, with the first floor home to various grocers and tailors, as well as businesses ranging from a saloon to a barber and a beauty shop. Let's now look briefly, as we wrap up things, at how the Bloomington-Normal community has memorialized the establishment of the Republican Party and Lincoln's lost speech. This marker was affixed to the east wall of Majors Hall. It references the lost speech, but a lot of the space, right, is devoted to the marker sponsors, the Daughters of the American Revolution. That's the group's symbol at top. Here's another view of Majors Hall. This one in 1923, I've circled the DAR lost speech plaque or marker in red. Note that the first floor is occupied by a Kroger grocery. How cool is that, right? Despite a preservation battle, Majors Hall fell to the wrecking ball in February 1959, all for surface parking, for a surface parking lot, and a dozen or so parking spaces, right? A huge preservation blow to the Twin Cities. Yes, the Abraham Lincoln Municipal Parking Deck. And yes, later on, a multi-story parking garage was erected on this site. So once the building's fate was sealed, once Majors Hall's, they knew it was going to be torn down, funds were raised for an ornamental brick wall to hold a collection of bronze plaques, which had accumulated over the years, commemorating not only Majors Hall, but also the lost speech. So this wall of plaques was dedicated by none other than U.S. Senator Everett M. Dirksen in the fall of 1962. There's another view. So we have 6 plaques, 1 audio tour sign, and 1 looking for Lincoln Wayside, which I will talk about in a moment. The old masonry assemblage has been updated. It's made of poured concrete now, though some of the Majors Hall bricks were saved and used to frame the plaques and tablets. So let's look at 4 of the 6 plaques on the upper left. That's a plaque memorializing a local attorney and historical society president. Upper right, a representation of Majors Hall and its namesake. Lower left, birthplace of the Illinois GOP, Grand Old Party, the Illinois Republican Party, and a quote from Lincoln from the Lincoln-Douglas debate at Fremont, where Lincoln says, quote, "I have always supposed myself since the organization of the Republican Party at Bloomington in May 1856 bound as a party man." What Lincoln was telling the good people of Freeport during one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, that he was always bound to the platform of the Republican Party since this convention in May of 1856 in Bloomington was gavelled to a close. Lower right, another significant famed acclaim to Majors Hall was that it housed the earliest classes of the Normal University, what we now know as Illinois State University, before the first campus building was opened north of here in Normal in 1861. Founded in 1857, ISU is older by a decade than the University of Illinois. So as an ISU alum, I like to remind U of I grads of that fact whenever I can, and I just did. The last 2 plaques, right? Upper left, generally accepted as close to Lincoln's concluding statement of the lost speech, and I've already alluded to this. Quote, "We say to our Southern brethren, we won't go out of the Union, and you shan't," right? This is 6 years before the Civil War gets underway, and there's already threats, right, north and south, about secession. Lower right is the DAR plaque going all the way back to 1918. So what have we learned, right? That Lincoln spoke here, that what he said was lost, that something was remembered about what Lincoln said, and the building where Lincoln said these things has since been torn down. Does all this plaquing I'm using that as a verb, tell a visitor much of anything. I will note that there is no plaque that reads something to this effect. Quote, Abraham Lincoln and other Illinoisans gathered here to organize the Illinois Republican Party, which was dedicated to halting the spread of African American slavery. What's missing is any mention of slavery or Black Americans. The Looking for Lincoln wayside has rectified that, and again, I'll get to that in a moment. But for decades, in many ways, when this community made an effort to publicly commemorate the most important event ever to take place locally, if you want to talk about impact nationally, right? We lost the fact that central to this story is the role of African American people in the great and messy experiment to rid this nation of slavery. You're not going to learn that in these 6 plaques, right? In addition to that, for much of the 20th century, there was an annual local gathering to commemorate the anti-Nebraska convention and Lincoln's lost speech. Yet guest speakers, politicians, and historians tended to downplay Lincoln's aggressively anti-slavery rhetoric in favor of a folksy tale to explain why there existed no transcription of his keynote address. Yes, there was one more plaque dedicated on May 29th, 1956 at the McLean County Historical Society. It was sponsored by the McLean County Historical Society. That's my employer, now the Museum of History. And it commemorates the 100th anniversary of the lost speech. So there were speeches and the unveiling of this plaque, right? This is in the old courthouse, which is now the museum of the McLean County Museum of History. It's one floor down below me, and it hasn't changed the position in all these years since it was installed in 1956. At this event on May 29, 1956, 100 years after the lost speech, there was much ado over Lincoln's supposed aw shucks folkiness, right? If perhaps this was in order to make him somehow less radical in the eyes of Cold War America, right? The title of Lincoln scholar Lewis A. Warren's speech this day was The Charm of Lincoln's Oratory, right? But when it comes to the anti-Nebraska convention, should we think of Lincoln's oratory as charming, or should we think of it like William Herndon did, set ablaze by the divine fires of a soul maddened by the wrong? Okay, I promise I'm wrapping up, and I apologize for being late. More than a decade ago, prominent historian Roger Bridges, former director of the Illinois State Historical Society and director emeritus of the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center in Ohio, among many accomplishments. We were lucky to have Roger retire in Bloomington Normal. So Roger Bridges, this is about a decade ago, works with then McLean County Museum of History Executive Director Greg Coos to create more than a dozen such local Looking for Lincoln waysides, and these are erected in downtown Bloomington at the David Davis Mansion State Historic Site just east of where I am, the Illinois State University campus and environs to the north of where I am. Roger and Greg's lost speech wayside offers a long overdue corrective on previous attempts to remember or commemorate the convention held on May 29, 1856. Here you at last get a sophisticated look at the lost speech, placed in the context of the turbulent political climate and the violence of the day. So congratulations, Looking for Lincoln, right? The wayside makes use of Lincoln's 1855 letter to his good friend Joshua Speed, in which Lincoln declares that the Kansas-Nebraska Act, quote, was conceived in violence, passed in violence, maintained in violence, and is being executed in violence. Oh, we will skip past that. Well, I hope that I've given you a vivid impression of Abraham Lincoln's lost speech and the ideals and the promise, the radicalism even, that underpinned the new anti-slavery extension movement we know today as the Republican Party. It's a story now too often forgotten, but it's a fabulous story, right? Very exciting. But it's forgotten, either accidentally or sometimes, I think, intentionally, right? But when it comes to Lincoln and the decade before the Civil War, it's the nation's most important story, right? And one that still holds tremendous meaning for this country of ours today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm going to remove the slides now. Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Fieser, and I'm the program manager for Looking for Lincoln in the Abraham Lincoln National Heritage Area. And it is now time to take your questions. I know some of you have started to type questions in the chat, but if you would please type your questions on either YouTube or on Facebook in the chat, I will ask Bill the questions, and we will try to get through as many of them as time allows. All right, so our first question, okay, it says, in August of 1856, Lincoln delivered his only speech in Michigan. That speech was reported in the Detroit Tribune. Could that speech be a later variation of the lost speech?
Yes, and I just did not have, that's a great question. And a lot of people listening know more about Lincoln than I do, so that's a little daunting, let me just say that. But one part of this talk I had to cut was that there are fragments and there are parts of Lincoln's speeches that he gives in 1856. There's wonderful fragments from a speech he gives in Galena, which I could use for this talk because he's echoing a lot of things that sound familiar when you look at the lost speech. So yes, the speech in Michigan potentially has something to mind, certainly.
Okay, here's our next question. It says, even though the Whitney version of the Lincoln's last speech was rejected because of the 40-year gap between the speech and the publication of it in the McClure's magazine in 1895, does this incorrect version still exist, or was it destroyed?
Yeah, I don't know where Whitney, he said what appeared in, let's go back, I guess, if I could, I can't go back on slides. That's okay, we don't need to do that. But the lost speech, at least Whitney's version, appears in McClure's magazine. And again, I didn't have time to kind of use that as a kicker to end the program because it's such a fascinating story that here is a fellow traveler with Lincoln, an 8th Judicial Circuit attorney, and so many years after the lost speech, lo and behold, he says, looky what I have here, even though he had already written a book on the 8th Judicial Circuit. So Ida Tarbell found it fascinating, and she published it in her McClure's magazine. She served as the editor, but it was quickly debunked. Though for quite a while afterwards, it appears in some standard Lincoln biographies, like Carl Sandburg uses it, Albert Beveridge makes use of it, Ida Tarbell makes use of it, but nobody does today. So Whitney submitted handwritten notes he had taken of the lost speech, and that's what then was transcribed into McClure's. I don't know where Whitney's notes are today, but you can certainly read the article in McClure's magazine. I don't know if it's available directly digitally, but somehow you can get a hold of that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here is our next question, and this is definitely talking about Abraham Lincoln here. So were Lincoln's abolitionist tendencies played down, not just then, but as part of the subsequent lost cause mythology that he only cared about preserving the Union?
Yeah, I think there's general consensus among American historians that that is indeed the fact, indeed correct. Yes. Lincoln himself, though, in the 1850s had to underplay whatever tenuous support he had for black people, right? Because most of white northern voters would be what we would term today as racist, right? Did not want free blacks moving into their state to compete for jobs, to become farmers, to become successful citizens, right? It's one of the great tragedies. It is the great tragedy in our country, and we're still working through this today. So, yes, I think Lincoln's radicalism was certainly downplayed in the first half of the 20th century, with the lost cause becoming popular.
Okay. All right, here's our next question, and I think you've addressed this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway. So, is there a transcript of the speech? No,
there is no transcript. You have to find little pieces here, little pieces there. If I had, like I said, another 15, 20, 25 minutes, I could have delved into some of the reminiscences and recollections. Again, this body of material that Lincoln historians, prominently Michael Burlingame, but others have really tapped into the last several decades. So you have to be very careful how you treat this material. But there's a lot of good accounts of people talking about the lost speech, their impressions and snippets of what Lincoln said, and I didn't really mine any of that here. But there is no transcription, nothing close to that.
Okay. So I have a question. In your talk tonight, you talked a lot about Lincoln's speech and how it was talked about as being very fiery. And I think for a lot of people, when we think about Lincoln, we think of the second inaugural, or we think of the Gettysburg Address, and neither of those are what one would call fiery. So he must have been. It was. Do you think the last speech was extemporaneous and it wasn't actually ever written down?
See, I think
he just basically spoke what he was super passionate about, and that's why there isn't anything probably.
Yeah, I think according to some accounts, Lincoln had some notes in his hands, so he had evidently sketched out kind of the architecture of his speech and perhaps some prominent arguments. But he had told someone, I can't remember exactly who, that he was just going to let the inspiration of the moment kind of carry him through. And obviously, I think he did get carried away to a considerable extent, right? But he had been giving speeches similar to this since passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. So for Lincoln to give an hour-and-a-half speech on such a vital topic to the nation's future, right, wasn't all that difficult, at least a lot easier than it would be for us.
And something he was so passionate about. I mean, it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that got Lincoln back into politics. So, I mean, it was not like he was talking about something that he wasn't impassioned about.
Yeah, he was really a failed one-term congressman, kind of dispirited after that experience as a Whig in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. He returns to Springfield, and he decided to really devote his life to the law career, right? Become a successful attorney, which he does. But again, passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act arouses him to come back to the political stage, and he's a fighter to the end.
All right, so here's our next question from the audience. Given how the election of Lincoln immediately led to the secession of the southern states by the time of his inauguration, is it possible that this was more widely known at the time than we think?
Lincoln's law speech?
Yeah, or maybe even his views on...
Yeah, I mean, again, Lincoln wanted to proscribe or contain slavery where it existed, and again, allow it to wither and die on the vine. He was pretty explicit in saying those things, right? He also said a house divided cannot stand, either half free or half slave. So those were dangerous words, especially to a Southerner whose livelihood was based on human bondage. So for them, it was also an existential question. If slavery could not expand, could not grow, they saw the future, right? Because slavery could not really compete with free labor, right? The North was leaps and bounds ahead of the South when it came to vibrancy and economic activity. And that was only to become increasingly self-evident. So I think Southerners were well aware of the radicalism in many ways of Lincoln, although, he promised not to touch slavery where it existed, but that was not enough to save the Union for 4 years.
Yeah. All right, here's our next question. Are there any other historically significant buildings that are still standing in Bloomington that date back to 1856?
Yeah. Now, Guy Fraker, Lincoln scholar, retired local attorney, has argued, and I can't speak to this, but Guy, bless his heart, has said that Bloomington has about as many buildings with direct connections to Lincoln as any city in Illinois. And I don't know if that's true, but yes, there is a cluster within a block or two of the courthouse square where I am, and then a few residences in the city itself of Bloomington that we know Lincoln was in and out of. So yes, we have other Lincoln buildings. As Greg Coos, the director emeritus of the McLean County Museum of History, says, we have buildings that have Lincoln juice.
Yeah, and I will put a plug in for your walking tour of downtown Bloomington that talks about Lincoln's connection to many of the places that some of which are there and some of which have been replaced. But that is a great way to explore downtown Bloomington and learn about Lincoln history. So we are wrapping up our program, Bill. And the last question that I ask all of our presenters is, why is it important, or why do you think it's important to study Abraham Lincoln's life in the 21st century?
Yeah, I don't know if I can directly answer that. I've always looked at Lincoln, or at least in the last 20 or so years as I've come to study his life, as Lincoln is like, this may sound a little hokey, so bear with me here, kind of like a work of art, right? Like John Coltrane's Love Supreme or Shakespeare's King Lear, right? You can bounce all of the human condition off of him, right? And learn something, gain something, right? He was that fascinating, and he lived in such a fascinating time and made such fascinating decisions, right? Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, sometimes we're not quite sure. So he's really, in that way, an immortal figure, whether it's warfare, technology, communication, depression, family relations, political machinations. You could go on and on. There's something there for everybody for Lincoln, and we're still learning more about the man, his movement, and his time as well. So even though some are exhausted, I think there's still some wells to be tapped for sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for presenting your program on the Not So Lost speech. So thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next month. So thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.